Welcome to another thrilling Miss Marple Detective Mystery audiobook, The Fateful Encounter. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating detective tale stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. We were excited to have you here again. Let's dive into another unforgettable tale. Act 1. The Perfect Setup. The fog lay thick over the village of Farncombe, curling in ghostly tendrils around its gabled cottages and cobbled lanes. The lamps along the high street burned dimly, their glow swallowed by the swirling mist. A distant church bell tolled the hour. 9 o'clock, a sound both solemn and final, as if pronouncing judgment upon the night itself. In a modest house at the end of a narrow lane, Evelyn Archer sat at her kitchen table, staring down at a collection of papers with an expression of weary resignation. A single candle flickered beside her, casting shifting shadows over the ink-stained pages. Letters from creditors, an overdue mortgage notice, and, most damning of all, the curt, impersonal words from her solicitor. She picked up one particularly offensive sheet and read it again, though she knew every word by heart. Final notice. Immediate payment required. Further delay will result in legal proceedings. A slight shiver passed through her, though the kitchen was warm from the dying embers in the grate. Legal proceedings? The words had an ugly, impersonal finality to them, the sort of phrase one read in newspapers when some unfortunate soul had been made destitute. Evelyn Archer, daughter of a once prosperous industrialist, reduced to a footnote in the village's quiet history, a cautionary tale of misfortune and folly. She set the letter down carefully, smoothing its creases with a delicate, almost reverential touch, as if by ordering its surface she might somehow impose order upon her life. It was no use. The numbers did not change, the ink did not fade. Her gaze drifted to the heavy oak bureau in the corner of the room. Once it had belonged to her father, a man of ambition and precision. He had kept his affairs meticulously documented, his ledgers balanced to the last farthing. Now the desk housed relics of a vanished prosperity, bundles of useless stock certificates, faded deeds to a house long sold, and, hidden in the bottom drawer, the last vestiges of her inheritance. Evelyn rose, crossing the room with the slow deliberation of a woman carrying an invisible weight. She knelt before the bureau, unlocked the drawer with a small brass key, and withdrew a slender stack of banknotes. It was all that remained, enough to last another month or two if she was careful, not enough to stop the inevitable. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. So this is what it has come to, a respectable woman reduced to counting her days like a prisoner marking the walls of a cell. There was a rustling sound outside, the wind picking up through the hedgerows, rattling against the window panes. The village was always so quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that magnified small noises into something greater, an owl's hoot, the snap of a twig, the shuffle of unseen movement. Evelyn turned back to the papers on the table. It was not merely money that troubled her. It was what came with the loss of it, the smothering sense of helplessness, the knowledge that her options were narrowing with each passing day. She had thought of selling the house, but it was entangled in legal complications, a wretched reminder of the past mistakes she had inherited. She had thought of borrowing, but there was no one left to ask. There was one final option, of course, one last, desperate idea. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Slowly she pulled a sheet of paper towards her and began to write. The words came hesitantly at first, as though the mere act of committing them to paper made the scheme more real. To whom it may concern, I am in possession of valuables, enough to make it worth your while. My home, isolated as it is, offers ample opportunity. I will not resist. I ask only that you take what you need and leave. Discretion will be ensured. She sat back, staring at what she had written. The candle flame flickered, as if in silent judgment. Was she truly contemplating such a thing? Inviting crime upon herself? Orchestrating a theft of her own possessions? It was unthinkable. And yet, what other choice remained? Evelyn's hands were steady as she folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. There was still time to reconsider, still time to tear it up and pretend she had never entertained the thought. But some invisible threshold had been crossed. Tomorrow she would post the letter. For now she simply sat there in the candlelight, listening to the wind, the darkness pressing close around her like an old acquaintance returned at last. The study was a small, sombre room, lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and heavy drapes that muffled the world outside. A single lamp, its light golden but dim, cast a modest glow over the cluttered desk where Evelyn Archer sat, pen poised over a crisp sheet of writing paper. The house was silent. Even the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to hold its breath, its usual ticking muffled by the oppressive hush that filled the space. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes like a living thing, its swirling tendrils visible whenever the lamp's flickering glow caught the glass. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she dipped the pen into the inkwell, her breath measured and deliberate. The act she was about to commit was not merely reckless. It was, if one were to be precise, an invitation to crime. "To whom it may concern," she began, her handwriting neat but hesitant. She paused, lifting the nib for a moment as if reconsidering. Then, after a deep breath, she continued, "I am in possession of certain valuables, enough to make it worth your while. My home, isolated as it is, offers ample opportunity. I will not resist. I ask only that you take what you need and leave. Discretion will be ensured." The words sat stark on the page, their meaning clear, yet deliberately ambiguous. She had considered something more direct, a straightforward advertisement in one of those underground circles where desperate men arranged unspeakable transactions, but such a thing was too crude, too dangerous. No, this was better, a simple message, worded carefully, placed into the right hands. Her eyes flicked to the small stack of papers at the edge of the desk. Her father's old financial records, faded newspaper clippings, a stack of unpaid bills. They were the weight of her past and present combined, tangible evidence of the ruin she had spent years trying to outmaneuver. There was a quiet sound, just a faint shuffle, somewhere beyond the door. Evelyn's head snapped up, heart hammering. But it was only the wind again, sighing through the old house, shifting against the beams like a restless ghost. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her chest before turning back to the letter. "I will leave my study window unlocked on the evening of the 21st. Another pause. She flexed her fingers, feeling the stiffness in her joints. It was absurd, truly, how a simple act of writing could feel so final. She read the letter twice. It was perfect in its vagueness, just enough of a hint to attract the right sort of individual, but not so direct as to leave her entirely exposed. A thief, an opportunist, someone hungry for easy gain. These were the kinds of people who would understand such an offer. And yet, beneath the surface there was something else, a deeper game, a shadow of intent that she barely allowed herself to acknowledge. This was not merely a plea to be robbed, it was a transaction, one she intended to control. With deliberate care, Evelyn folded the letter, sliding it into a plain envelope. No return address, no signature. The ink was barely dry when she reached for a box of matches. Holding one against a small brass striker, she watched the flame flicker to life before touching it to the edge of another piece of paper. The draft of an entirely different letter she had once considered. She watched the flame consume it, blackening the words before curling them into nothing. Then, with the same quiet resolve, she rose, crossed the room, and placed the sealed envelope inside the false bottom of her father's desk drawer. Tomorrow it would find its way into the right hands, and then the waiting would begin. The Rosewood Tea Room was a place of little consequence to the outside world, but of utmost importance to the village of Farncombe. Situated at the corner of the High Street, just beyond the greengrocer's and opposite the post office, it was a sanctuary of genteel routine. The lace-curtained windows allowed in the pale morning sunlight, illuminating the faint swirl of steam rising from freshly poured cups of tea. At a small table near the window, Miss Agatha Marple stirred her tea with delicate precision. She was, as always, dressed with quiet respectability. A navy blue dress, sensible hat, and lace gloves that had seen better days, but were still worn out of habit rather than necessity. Her keen blue eyes twinkled as she listened unobtrusively to the pleasant hum of conversation around her. Village life, she often reflected, had a rhythm as predictable as a clock. There were set times for gossip, the post office queue at 10, the market at 11, the tea room between 3:30 and 4. And it was here, amidst the gentle clink of china and the faint aroma of buttered scones, that she found the finest threads of intrigue. "Quite out of sorts, I tell you," said Mrs. Fairchild, a stout woman with a fondness for dramatic emphasis. She leaned forward, her ample bosom nearly toppling the sugar bowl, her voice hushed, but not nearly hushed enough. "Evelyn Archer behaving very oddly indeed. And you know she was always so proper, never one for scenes." Miss Marple lifted her cup, taking a careful sip. Evelyn Archer. Now that was interesting. "Poor dear," sighed Miss Trumbull, a spinster of excellent pedigree and vague opinions. "Ever since her father passed, things have been difficult for her. But one doesn't expect, peculiarities." "Peculiarities, my dear, are just the beginning," Mrs. Fairchild declared. "I saw her myself, pacing outside the post office in the evening of all times, looking as though she didn't quite know whether to go in or run the other way. And I said to myself, that is a woman on the verge of something dreadful." Miss Marple glanced up over her spectacles. "Perhaps she was waiting for a letter?" Mrs. Fairchild beamed at the encouragement. "Exactly. And if I were to guess, I'd say it was not a letter one would expect a respectable lady to receive. She had the look of a woman carrying a secret." "A great many people do, my dear," Miss Marple remarked mildly, placing another lump of sugar into her cup. Miss Trumbull frowned, creasing her already fine-lined face. "I do hope there's no scandal. Evelyn has always been a private sort, but never one for foolishness," Mrs. Fairchild sniffed. "Private is one thing, but when a woman is seen lingering about the post office in a state of distress, and the very next day she's sending mysterious letters with no return address, one begins to wonder." "Almost indeed," murmured Miss Marple, setting her cup down with careful precision. A faint breeze stirred the lace curtains. Outside, the village ticked along in its orderly fashion. Delivery boys on bicycles, Mrs. Perry polishing the brass bell outside her haberdashery, the rector greeting passers-by with an absent-minded nod. Everything was as it should be. And yet, Miss Marple had lived too long and listened too well to believe in coincidences. People did not suddenly begin behaving oddly for no reason. There was always a cause, whether it was something as simple as an unpaid bill or as dire as a guilty conscience. As the conversation drifted on to other matters, Mr. Caldwell's missing garden shears, the regrettable state of young Daphne Morton's engagement, Miss Marple sat back, hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. Nothing in Farncombe was ever truly hidden. One only had to listen, to watch, to notice. And Miss Marple was very, very good at noticing. The night lay thick and heavy over Farncombe, the kind of night that pressed in close and muffled the usual rustlings of village life. The gas lamps flickered weakly against the encroaching mist, their light barely stretching beyond the cobbled streets. Most of the houses had already surrendered to darkness, their curtains drawn tight, their inhabitants safely ensconced in the familiar rhythms of sleep. But not every house. On the outskirts of the village, where the neat hedgerows gave way to broader stretches of land, Evelyn Archer's home stood silent and waiting, a modest but once respectable dwelling. Its peaked roof and ivy-covered walls spoke of faded prosperity. Tonight, however, it was something else entirely, a stage set for an act most peculiar. And, in the darkness, the players arrived. They moved with eerie precision, 3 shadowy figures gliding through the mist. No hesitation, no whispered orders. Each man, if they were men at all, seemed to know his part to perfection. The first slipped into the alley that ran alongside the house, disappearing into the deeper gloom. A moment later, the faintest glint of metal flashed as he expertly dismantled the lock on the study window. No fumbling, no second attempts. It was the work of a professional. The second took his place by the front door, his gloved hands testing the handle once, twice, before moving with practiced ease to the lock. A soft click, barely audible, then silence once more. The third lingered on the street corner, a figure wrapped in darkness, standing as still as a shadow, watching, waiting. Inside the house, everything remained undisturbed. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its rhythmic beat the only sound in the quiet study. A faint breeze whispered through the opened window, barely disturbing the heavy drapes. The house had been left exactly as expected. No light, no noise, no sign of its owner. The men moved as one. The first slid into the study, taking a moment to scan the room before signalling to the others. The second followed, closing the door with the kind of care that suggested this was not their first such visit. The third lingered a moment longer outside, his head tilting slightly as though listening. Then, apparently satisfied, he stepped over the threshold and vanished into the house. They knew what they were looking for. The leader moved towards the large oak bureau in the corner, his fingers trailing lightly over the polished surface before reaching for the bottom drawer. He tried it once, locked. A small smile. Meanwhile, the second man moved swiftly through the room, his keen eyes scanning the bookshelves, the desk, the neat stacks of correspondence. He did not rifle, he did not waste time, this was no careless burglary. The third man remained by the door, listening, always listening. The lock gave way with the faintest snap, and the leader eased the drawer open. A collection of neatly bound papers sat inside. Documents, letters, small ledgers filled with careful handwriting, and beneath them a single envelope, unmarked. He lifted it carefully, turning it once in the dim light before slipping it into the inner pocket of his coat. A nod to the others, the job was done. No hurried movements, no frantic retreat. They left as they had come, silent, methodical, invisible. Within moments the house was still once more. The only evidence of their presence was the slight disturbance of dust on the bureau, the lingering chill from the open window, and the empty space where Evelyn Archer's letter had been. Outside the mist swallowed them whole, and the village of Farncombe slept on, blissfully unaware. The house was silent, but for the slow, methodical ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Each measured second stretched into an eternity. A rhythmic reminder of time slipping away, of choices made that could not be undone. Evelyn Archer stood motionless in the shadowed corner of her living room, pressed against the wall just beyond the threshold to the study. The heavy curtains had been drawn tight, shrouding the space in deep pools of darkness. She had positioned herself carefully, just close enough to see, but not close enough to be seen. From her vantage point, she could make out the figures moving with uncanny precision, their silhouettes cutting against the faint spill of moonlight through the window. They were not the fumbling, desperate thieves of lurid penny novels. No, these men were professionals. Their movements were swift and practiced, their intent unmistakable. She could hear the faintest whisper of fabric as one of them crossed the floor, the soft scrape of metal against wood as another worked the lock of her father's desk. It was an oddly intimate sound, as though her home itself was holding its breath, complicit in the act. Her fingers curled into her palm, nails pressing into her skin. She should have been relieved. This was, after all, exactly what she had planned, and yet a flicker of hesitation, cold and insidious, whispered through her mind. She had expected the break-in to be quick, crude even, an opportunistic theft, nothing more. But these men moved with the efficiency of those accustomed to operating in silence, to taking what they wanted without hesitation. Had she miscalculated? A shiver ran through her, though the room was not cold. Her throat tightened, her breath shallow as she watched the leader of the group slide open the bottom drawer of the bureau. He worked swiftly, skimming past the irrelevant documents, his movements betraying an eerie familiarity. He knows what he is looking for. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. A single tear welled at the corner of her eye. But she did not let it fall. She had rehearsed this moment, imagined it 100 different ways, steeled herself against fear. And yet, as she watched the man lift the envelope, her stomach twisted into a knot of something perilously close to regret, She had set this plan in motion. She had invited the danger in. But had she also just set something loose that she could no longer control? The leader turned, slipping the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat, a sharp nod to the others. It was time. The men moved soundlessly, slipping back into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. The window was closed once more, the latch barely disturbed. Within moments, the only sign of their presence was the lingering weight of their absence and the space where Evelyn's secret had been. She remained frozen in place long after the house fell silent again. When she finally exhaled, her breath came out in a shudder. It was done. And now the real waiting would begin. A hush had settled over the house. The study, so recently the scene of a crime, bore its wounds with quiet dignity. A faint breeze curled in through the window, shifting the heavy drapes, as if whispering secrets to the dark. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Deliberate, patient, unaware that time itself had just marked a moment of irreversible consequence. Evelyn Archer stood motionless in the doorway. She had not moved since the last shadow disappeared into the night, nor had she dared to step forward and confront the reality of what had just taken place. The house, her house, felt foreign now, as though it had been transformed in the space of minutes from a sanctuary into something else entirely. Slowly she exhaled. The bureau drawer stood ajar, a silent accusation. Books had been shifted ever so slightly, as though disturbed by hands that sought but did not fumble. The robbers had been precise, clinical in their efficiency. There was no senseless ransacking, no overturned furniture, no careless footprints left behind. It was perfect, too perfect. Evelyn swallowed against the unease tightening in her throat. It should have reassured her that they had taken what she had intended for them to find, but something else lingered, an unsettled feeling, an unspoken warning curling at the edges of her mind. She stepped forward, carefully, cautiously, her fingers grazing the surface of the desk. A fine layer of dust had been disturbed, not in broad, careless strokes, but in precise little circles. A finger, perhaps, tracing absent-mindedly as someone had readied themselves to depart. And then she saw it. A small, metallic object rested near the base of the lamp. Not hers, not something that had been there before, a token left behind, deliberately placed. It was a coin. No, not quite a coin, a medallion of sorts, about the size of a shilling with an intricate design etched into its surface. Aveline picked it up with slow, deliberate fingers, turning it over in the dim light. The engraving was peculiar. A stylized bird, perhaps a raven or a crow, its wings unfurled in a motion that suggested both flight and entrapment. Below it a single word, vigilat. She did not recognize it. A cold sensation trickled down her spine, an entirely new kind of fear. Who had left it, and why? This was not the signature of a common burglar. This was something else entirely. A message. A warning or a clue to something far greater than her own desperate designs? She set the token down carefully, as though it might vanish if she looked away. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. Somewhere in the night the wind rose, rattling the window panes with impatient fingers. The house remained still, bearing its secrets with the same patient silence. Evelyn Archer, however, was no longer so sure she had orchestrated this event entirely on her own terms. The Farncombe police station was a modest affair, a squat red-brick building tucked between the town solicitor's office and a rather overgrown churchyard. It was the sort of place where law and order largely involved disputes over wandering livestock or the occasional missing bicycle. Burglary, particularly one of such a deliberate and professional nature, was most irregular. Inside, the air smelt faintly of polished wood, damp coats, and pipe tobacco. The constables on duty spoke in low voices, their usual air of unhurried routine replaced with something more guarded. Sergeant Alfred Graves sat at his desk, drumming his fingers idly against a report. He was a man of 50-odd years, with a thick-set frame and an expression of perpetual scepticism, as though life itself had repeatedly failed to meet his expectations. Across from him, Constable Leonard Pierce shifted awkwardly, the freshly transcribed burglary report clutched in his hands. Graves exhaled through his nose. "So, let's go over it again. No signs of forced entry?" "No, sir," Pierce confirmed, nodding gravely. "Nothing taken that wasn't expected?" "No, sir. No broken glass, no heavy footprints, no ransacking?" Pierce hesitated. "The study was disturbed, but not in the usual way." Graves leaned back, rubbing his chin. "No amateur work, then. Nothing done in a hurry. No reckless grabbing at jewellery or silverware. What did they take?" Pierce glanced down at his notes. "Miss Archer reports that certain documents were removed from her father's desk." Graves grunted. "That's peculiar." "Yes, sir." A silence settled between them. A burglary that wasn't quite a burglary. Nothing common about it, no smashed windows, no rummaging for valuables, just papers. And then, of course, there was the token. Graves picked it up from the desk, turning it between his fingers. The medallion was small, but unmistakably deliberate in its design. "What do you make of this, Pierce?" Pierce hesitated, as if reluctant to voice an opinion on something that carried an air of deliberate mystery. "Something to leave behind, sir." "Very odd indeed." Graves exhaled through his nose, placing the medallion back on the desk. "Now, Miss Archer," he said, eyes narrowing slightly, "how did she seem to you?" Pierce shifted again. "Well, sir, shaken, as you'd expect, but—" Graves arched a brow. "But," Pierce cleared his throat, "not entirely surprised, if you follow me." Graves did, and he didn't like it. He rubbed his temple, gaze flicking back to the report. Something about all of this was off. A crime too neat, a victim too prepared, and a medallion left behind like some kind of calling card. It wasn't burglary, that much was certain. But what was it? The station clock chimed the hour. A chill crept in from the draughty window, and Graves had the distinct impression that something far larger had begun, something just out of reach. "Right," he said finally. "Best we keep our eyes open, Pierce." A pause. "Let's see what Miss Marple makes of it." The village of Farncombe was, by all outward appearances, a place of quiet respectability. Its thatched cottages and neatly trimmed hedgerows exuded an air of timeless order, the kind of place where days passed with the reassuring predictability of a well-wound clock. But beneath that placid surface, as Miss Agatha Marple well knew, there was always something simmering. This morning, however, there was a distinct edge to the usual village chatter. The burglary at Evelyn Archer's home had unsettled people, and in a place where nothing truly went unnoticed, it was the kind of event that took on a life of its own. Wrapped in her sensible wool coat, Miss Marple moved through the village with the ease of someone who had long mastered the art of blending into the scenery. She did not interrogate, oh no, that would only make people wary. Instead, she simply listened. Her first stop was Mrs. Perry's haberdashery, where women gathered in the mid-morning to discuss the affairs of the world over bolts of fabric and sewing notions. The bell above the door chimed as Miss Marple entered, prompting a chorus of greetings from those assembled. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard?" Mrs. Perry herself, a stout woman with a shrewd eye for both fine embroidery and local scandal, bustled forward. "Simply dreadful about Evelyn Archer. A burglary, right in the heart of the village. Who would have thought?" "Who indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, removing her gloves with careful precision. "Quite an unusual sort of burglary, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Perry's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a woman who knew she had information worth sharing. "Very unusual. No broken windows, no mess, nothing taken except, well, papers, of all things." "Papers?" Miss Marple echoed, with just the right amount of mild surprise. Mrs. Perry nodded gravely. "Yes, and the way it was done. Not some ruffian in the night, no clumsy break-in. Too professional, if you ask me. That's what young Mr. Graham said. He saw them." Did he now? Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her interest sharpened. Yes, indeed. He was out late delivering a parcel, such a responsible young man, and he saw something near Edlin's house. Said the men were too careful, moved without a sound, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers smoothing the lace trim of her gloves. And another thing, he swears they didn't come out the way they went in. He turned away just for a second, and when he looked back they were gone. Miss Marple tilted her head. How curious. Isn't it? And then there's that thing they left behind. The token, Miss Marple supplied, watching Mrs. Perry closely. Mrs. Perry shivered. Gives me the creeps, if you ask me. Some sort of secret society, mark my words. And those types are never up to any good. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, amused smile. A secret society? Now, that does sound intriguing. Mrs. Perry sniffed. Well, I shan't be sleeping easy until we know what really happened. Miss Marple patted her arm reassuringly. Nor, I dare say, will Evelyn Archer. She left the shop soon after, but as she stepped onto the cobbled street, her mind was already sifting through the pieces of the puzzle, a burglary that was too professional, a disappearance that was too seamless, and a token deliberately left behind. It was all quite deliberate, and Miss Marple never trusted anything that felt too deliberate. The village post office sat snugly at the end of High Street, its squat stone facade bearing the quiet dignity of a building that had served generations. It was a place of routine. Morning letters, afternoon newspapers, and the occasional parcel containing mysteries known only to their senders. Miss Agatha Marple did not often frequent the post office at this hour, midday when the bustle of the village had lulled into a comfortable quiet, but today she had found herself drawn to it. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps, as she often thought to herself, there were times when a lady simply happened upon things. She stepped lightly onto the garden path that bordered the building, her sharp eyes taking in the well-tended hedges and neat rows of daisies. The postmistress, Miss Wilkins, prided herself on keeping the grounds tidy, and Miss Marple had always found that such careful order could often highlight the presence of something out of place. And indeed there was something out of place. Near the base of a stone bench half buried in the gravel lay a small, glinting object. At first glance it might have been nothing more than a bit of discarded metal, a stray button or a bent hairpin, but when Miss Marple crouched to inspect it, she found something far more curious. A cufflink. It was no ordinary cufflink either. It was a fine piece, silver, with an engraving of a raven in flight, an almost identical image to the token left behind at Evelyn Archer's home. Miss Marple's gloved fingers brushed over the metal, and a small frown settled on her usually pleasant face. It was a strange thing to find outside a village post office, particularly when there were so few men in Farncombe who would wear something so ostentatious. Her mind ticked through the possibilities. There was Colonel Braithwaite, of course, always impeccably dressed, though he preferred more conservative gold studs. Mr. Sims, the banker, favoured simple pearl cufflinks. No, this was something different, something foreign. She straightened, slipping the cufflink into her handbag with an air of quiet satisfaction. It was, after all, just a small thing, but small things had a way of leading to much larger revelations. She cast a glance at the post office door. If this was found here, then someone had lost it either coming in or out. But who? Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gazing at the narrow street, at the ordinary sights of village life continuing around her. And yet there was a feeling in the air, something shifting beneath the surface of routine, like a puzzle rearranging itself just out of view, a burglary that was too neat, a token deliberately left behind. And now this, Evelyn Archer's little scheme, if indeed it was hers at all, was beginning to look far less like an act of desperation, and far more like the opening move of something far grander. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Mysteries, after all, had a habit of unfolding once you knew where to look. The Archer estate stood on the outskirts of Farncombe, a grand but weary relic of a once prosperous lineage. Its high gables and ivy-draped walls whispered of an age when fortunes were made in industry, when the Archer name commanded respect, even a touch of fear. But time had softened its grandeur, dulled the brass fittings, and allowed the scent of dust and disuse to settle in the corridors. Miss Marple had not been here in years. She had been acquainted with the late Mr. Archer in passing, a formidable gentleman with a rather fixed opinion on matters both political and domestic. His daughter, Evelyn, had inherited his hauteur but none of his fortune, and now it seemed the past had begun to stir. She arrived at the estate by invitation, her presence requested by a distant relative, Mrs. Cordelia March, a woman who had been, at one time, something of a fixture in society, but who now contented herself with presiding over the remnants of Archer prestige. Mrs. March greeted her in the drawing-room, a cavernous space filled with heavy furniture and portraits of severe-looking ancestors. She was a woman of indeterminate age, well-dressed but watchful, as though she measured each visitor for worth before granting them the privilege of her company. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, gesturing toward a velvet chair, "such a pleasure. One hears so much about you." Miss Marple, who had long ago mastered the art of appearing both flattered and entirely unimpressed, simply smiled. "I was most interested to learn of your involvement in poor Evelyn's situation," Mrs. March continued, settling herself with a practised grace. "So very troubling, this burglary, and one does wonder if there's rather more to it." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "One does indeed." Mrs. March regarded her for a moment, as though deciding just how much to say. "You know, of course, that the Arches were not always as they are now. There was a time when this house, this family, held a position of considerable influence." "I recall," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. March leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Evelyn's father was a man of means, yes, but there were stories, my dear, stories of an older fortune, one that was never quite accounted for." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her interest sharpened. "Unaccounted fortunes have a way of resurfacing." Mrs. March nodded. "Precisely, and I have always wondered, where did it go?" Silence settled between them, heavy with implication. Then, with an air of reluctance, Mrs. March gestured toward the adjoining room. "You may find the library of some interest." Miss Marple rose with quiet efficiency. "How very kind of you." The library was a grand affair, though time had muted its grandeur. The scent of aged leather and yellowing paper filled the air. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, their contents arranged with more nostalgia than order. A great mahogany desk stood at the centre, its surface covered in neat stacks of correspondence. Miss Marple's gloved fingers trailed over the bindings as she moved with the ease of someone who appeared aimless, but was in fact quite the opposite. A glance, a pause, a careful selection. There was an art to uncovering secrets without appearing to seek them. She found them behind the glass doors of an old cabinet, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, tucked beside a weathered ledger. She opened the topmost envelope, and the past unfurled itself before her. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. "Reginald Archer, E.C.S., it began, in the manner of a man accustomed to formality. The contents, however, were far less composed. "I have kept my end of the arrangement, but I will not be made a fool. You assured me discretion. This was our agreement. If the truth comes to light, know that I will not stand." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the other letters. More of the same. Carefully worded threats, vague allusions to a financial matter never fully detailed. And then, at the bottom of the stack, a single page bearing the name of Evelyn Archer. She read the words carefully, noting the dates, the phrasing: "a forgotten fortune, a buried scandal, a warning passed down through ink and time." Miss Marple smiled to herself, folding the letter neatly and slipping it back into place. The past, she thought, had a rather inconvenient way of refusing to stay buried. A child's laughter once rang in these halls. though the house had long since swallowed the sound. Evelyn Archer had been raised in privilege but not in warmth. Her father, ever the businessman, had measured affection in currency and expectations. There had been lessons, piano, French, the art of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. And always there had been whispers. The Archer fortune had not been built on mere industry. There had been other dealings, matters that were never spoken of directly, but that hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Evelyn had learned young that certain doors remained closed, certain questions remained unanswered. She had watched from the staircase as men came and went, voices low, papers exchanged. Her father's temper, always carefully controlled, would sometimes slip when a name was mentioned, a name she had never quite caught, but that had seemed to hold power over him. And then, one day, there had been silence. Her father's affairs were suddenly settled, though no one explained how. The house remained, the fortune did not, and Evelyn, still young, had learned that debts could be erased, but at a price. Now, standing in the dim library, Miss Marple could almost hear the echoes of that childhood, a girl peeking from behind a banister, watching a world she did not fully understand. A fortune lost, a secret kept, and perhaps, just perhaps, a daughter who had inherited more than her father's name. Miss Marple straightened her hat and made her way back to the drawing-room. It seemed Evelyn Archer had been playing a much longer game than anyone had realized, and the past was about to catch up with her. The Archer estate was a house of shadow. Even by daylight, its corridors stretched long and dim, lit only by the occasional wall sconce or shaft of sunlight slicing through heavy drapes. The thick rugs muffled footsteps, the air held the scent of polished wood and old books, and the silence, expectant, seemed to press in from all sides. Miss Marple moved at an unhurried pace, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. She had always found that a slow, deliberate walk through such places had a way of drawing out the unseen, the unheard, the unspoken. She had just left the library, her mind still cataloguing the peculiarities of the letters she had uncovered. The implications of Evelyn Archer's past were beginning to take shape, though the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach, and then she heard it. Footsteps, hesitant but deliberate, following just behind her. She did not turn immediately. There were certain rules to these things. One never startled a bird that had not yet decided whether to fly. "Miss Marple!" The voice was low, edged with something that might have been urgency, or something darker. She paused just at the curve of the corridor before turning to face the speaker. "Mr. Godfrey Lansing." A man of quiet bearing and careful words, Godfrey had long been associated with the Archer family in a manner that was never fully defined. Not a relative, not quite a servant, yet somehow always present. He was a man who had learned the value of discretion early in life, and wore it now like an expertly tailored coat. He inclined his head politely. "I hope I'm not disturbing you?" Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes remained sharp. "Not at all, Mr. Lansing. A walk through the past is often best accompanied by good company." Godfrey did not return the smile. He was a man who did not waste gestures. "It is precisely that walk which concerns me." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, inviting him to continue. "You've been asking questions," he said quietly. "Reading old letters? Stirring the dust?" She gave a light laugh. "I find the dust is always most revealing, don't you?" He did not share her amusement. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Some things, Miss Marple, are meant to remain undisturbed." The weight of the words hung in the air between them. Not a threat, no. Godfrey Lansing was not a man to deal in blunt intimidation. It was something softer, more insidious. A warning? Miss Marple did not blink. "It seems to me that dust has a way of settling over things that people prefer to forget." Godfrey's lips tightened. "And yet, forgetting is sometimes the only way forward." A pause. A beat. Miss Marple observed him carefully. The tautness of his hands, the stiffness in his posture, a man accustomed to keeping his own secrets. She softened her tone just slightly. "You speak as someone who knows the weight of the past." His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, just for a moment, that flickered, a memory, a hesitation, then it was gone. He inclined his head. "Evelyn Archer is a woman who has suffered her share of misfortune. It would be best if you were not made to suffer more." Miss Marple studied him, her mind fitting the pieces together. Evelyn's inheritance, her father's dealings, the unfinished business of a long-buried scandal, and now a warning from a man who had been at the heart of it all. She smiled again, polite but unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. Lansing. I shall take that under consideration." A beat of silence. Then, with a nod, he stepped back, retreating down the corridor. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts knitting themselves together. Warnings were often issued by those with something to lose, and Mr. Godfrey Lansing, it seemed, had quite a bit he wished to keep buried. The Farncombe local archives were housed in a modest stone building that had once been the town magistrate's office. Now its shelves sagged under the weight of history, public records, old ledgers, and yellowed newspapers, all bearing witness to the quiet transgressions of the village's past. Miss Marple stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of ink and dust. A young clerk, barely out of school, glanced up from behind a towering stack of documents. "Ah, Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Oh, may I help you?" Miss Marple offered a benign smile. "Good morning, Mr. Finch. I was hoping to peruse some older editions of the Farncombe Gazette, something from, let's say 25 years ago." Mr. Finch hesitated, then gestured toward a row of bound newspapers stacked haphazardly on a side table. "It's all there, if you don't mind a bit of dust." "Dust never troubles me," Miss Marple assured him. Settling herself at the table, she flipped carefully through the brittle pages, her sharp eyes scanning headlines, her fingers trailing lightly over columns of inked scandal and forgotten grievances. And then she found it. "Financier mysterious collapse. Questions remain unanswered." The article was dated nearly 3 decades earlier, detailing the abrupt downfall of Reginald Archer, Evelyn's father, a man once lauded for his business acumen. He had been at the centre of a financial arrangement that had, quite suddenly, turned sour. Investors were left ruined, properties mysteriously changed hands, and, most curious of all, one key figure in the matter had vanished. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. A name caught her attention, scrawled in the margin in an unfamiliar hand. G.L. Knowes. "G.L.," she murmured. "Godfrey Lansing." She turned another page and found a smaller article buried in the back pages. "Maid speaks out on night of incident," a short piece in which a young domestic servant had claimed she saw papers burning in the fireplace of Archer Manor the night before Reginald Archer resigned from public life. Miss Marple sat back, thoughtful. There were gaps here, gaps filled with silence, missing documents, and a scandal that had been carefully ushered out of the public's memory. How important is Hemingway? But Evelyn Archer, it seemed, had grown up in the shadow of something much larger than a simple inheritance dispute. And now someone had made sure the past would not stay buried. The house was too quiet. Evelyn Archer sat at her desk, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the telephone as though it might spring to life of its own accord. Outside, the sky had darkened, casting long, twisting shadows through the drawn curtains. The robbery had left no physical damage. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed beyond what had been necessary, and yet the house no longer felt like hers. It was as though she had invited something in, something she could not now send away. Then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the telephone rang. She started, her breath catching. For a moment she considered letting it ring out. But then, slowly, she lifted the receiver. A pause, then a voice, low and deliberate. "Leave it alone." Evelyn's grip on the receiver tightened. "Who is this?" A longer pause. Then the line went dead. For a long moment she sat motionless, the dial tone humming in her ear. The past, it seemed, was not merely stirring, it was watching. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the warm glow of the fire casting soft flickers against the lace curtains. Before her, an array of clippings and notes lay, arranged with meticulous order, each piece fitting into a puzzle not yet fully formed. A steaming cup of tea sat within reach, though she had barely touched it. Her mind was too occupied, sifting through the layers of deception, the whispers of an old scandal that had never quite faded. Evelyn Archer's supposed misfortune was beginning to look far less like bad luck and far more like consequence. Someone had orchestrated that robbery, not for simple theft, but for something more deliberate. A warning? A retrieval? And then there was the matter of Godfrey Lansing. His name had been scrawled in the margin of an old newspaper, linked somehow to whatever had transpired in the Archer family's past. His warning to her earlier had been careful, measured, a man who knew too much, perhaps. Miss Marple picked up her teacup, finally taking a sip. The warmth was comforting, but her mind was elsewhere. There was a pattern here, a thread running through the years, binding the past to the present. The staged burglary, the missing papers, the cryptic message Evelyn had just received. These were not isolated events, and Miss Marple had never believed in coincidences. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the firelight. Yes, she thought, the pieces were beginning to align. The past was very much alive, and someone was determined to keep it that way.